All right, ready for part 7? I hope everybody's ready for part 7. Here we go. This is the 613 Commandments, part 7. Now this week we're going to have a slight challenge for some of you. It's a very simple challenge, but if you're reading out of most translations, the scriptures are going to be verses that are going to be a little bit different than if you're reading out of the actual Tanakh, like an Art Scroll Tanakh or a JPS Tanakh. Because, like I said, sometimes the way the Jews have broken up the chapters is slightly different than the ones who made what we call the Christian translations. Okay, so this is going to be one of the ones where we're not just off by one verse, we're going to actually be off by like 7 verses. So the first commandment we're going to deal with is commandment number 129, which is you shall add 1/5 to restitution of anything stolen. You shall add 1/5 of the value of restitution of anything that is stolen. Now in the Tanakh, this is chapter 5 of Leviticus, verse 23. In a lot of translations, your chapter 5 ends at verse 19. So this would be, we'll begin in chapter 6 and read verse 1, if you're in most translations. It says, and Yahweh spoke to Moshe, saying, when any being sins and committed a trespass against Yahweh and has lied to his neighbor about a deposit or about a pledge or about a robbery, or shall extort from his neighbor, or has found what was lost and has lied concerning it, or did swear falsely, so that he sins in regard to any one of these that a man does, then it shall be, when he sins, and shall be guilty, that he shall return whatever he took by robbery, and what he has extorted, or the deposit which he deposited, which was deposited with him, or the lost item which he found, or all that about which he swore falsely, he shall repay its total value and add 1/5 more to it and give it to whom it belongs on the day of his guilt offering. Then he brings his guilt offering to Yahweh, a ram, a perfect one from the flock, with your valuation as a guilt offering to the priest. Okay, so this is the laws about restitution when you have extorted, stolen, falsely represented something that didn't belong to you. Something that didn't belong to you. It could have been something you borrowed and then you didn't return what you were borrowed. You returned less than what you had. I mean, whatever it was, you had somebody else's stuff or you were obligated in some way and you stole, extorted, or misrepresented. Notice how Yahweh wants to make sure that you are sort of discouraged from ever doing that. He says, not only will you return all of it, but you'll also add 1/5 on top of it. That's 20% more. That's a lot. By the way, that same thing goes with tithing and offerings. If you're going to hold back a tithe or use the tithe for something it shouldn't be used, you got to make that up plus 1/5 also. It's the standard amount. It's going to be this 1/5. And so that is a commandment. Now, can we apply this today? You bet. Well, the limiter here is that there's no way to enforce it. That's our limiter. Some of the things we're going to find as we go through the 613 commandments is that the single limiter to the whole thing is the application of enforcement. Without a without a community that's living under these instructions with an authority structure, a judicial structure, there's no way to enforce these things. And so some of these things, while they would apply today, I think that you would be required to restore, and to restore with adding 1/5. There's no way to really enforce that. And so that's the one limiter. So that doesn't mean that it's done away with, nor does it mean that you're not obligated. It just means that nobody's going to be there to sit on you to make you do it. You have to self-impose. And I think you should take that very seriously, that you self-impose. Because yes, I think that this would still apply today. I don't think there's anything else limiting it, except there's nobody to make it happen. Let's go now to number 130. Commandment 130. You shall bring an asham, a guilt offering, an asham offering, which is a guilt offering for any conscious sin. Now this is a conscious sin. Let's look at this verse. It's chapter 6 and verse 9. It says, command Aaron and his son, saying, this is the Torah of the burnt offering. This is the burnt offering because it is burned on the altar all night until morning, and the fire of the altar is kept burning on it. And you're sitting there going, what does that have to do with what he just read here? Again, I don't know why they pick the verses they pick. Okay? That's one of those challenges. It's talking about the burnt offering. It doesn't mention here about anything to do with conscious sin. The burnt offering here is an asham offering. This is the right verse we're supposed to be reading. It just doesn't really give us anything to know what to do with it as far as that thing. Now we can go maybe back to verse 6 and say, where he brings his guilt offering to Yahweh, a ram, a perfect one, and the priest shall make atonement for him, and he shall be forgiven. He did that, made him guilty for whatever he did. Maybe that's what it maybe should be talking about, is going back to verse 6 and 7. Because clearly, that person was conscious of the sin. He may not have been conscious of it initially. He may have done it in some sort of inadvertent way. But then as soon as he became aware of it, he was required to restore and add a fifth. So now it became a conscious sin. And so that conscious sin was then dealt with a guilt offering. So perhaps the verse that he'd been really wanting to reference there would have been the verse in verses 6 and 7. Let's continue with number 131. Now again, commandment number 130, there's nothing to do. There's no offering to make at this point. The restitution is there to do. You can make restitution, you can add the fifth, but there's no priesthood, there's no temple, there's no place to do the offering. Number 131. Priests shall remove the ashes from the altar at the proper times. Priests shall remove the ashes at the proper times. That's verse 10 of chapter 6 here. And the priest shall put on his linen garment and put his linen trousers on his body and shall take up the ashes of the burnt offering, which the fire has consumed on the altar, and shall put them beside the altar. Okay, so there is an instruction that says the priests are to go ahead and take the ashes and deal with them. Now, this may sound to you like, well, this is again one of those wonderful illustrations that not every one of the 613 is going to apply to you. Because this is only for the priest, only when there's offerings being made, and dealing with the ashes. But yet it is one of the 613, at least according to Rambam. And so again, remember, the point of this whole series on the 613 was to unveil and reveal sort of the reality of, as opposed to the mystery, sort of this mysterious thing, the 613 commands. In the reality, there's not going to be 613 that apply to you. There's not going to be, and then of the ones that would apply to you, not all of those apply now because you can't do them. So even though it would apply to you, like for example, there's going to be ones that we're going to see where you would have to bring offerings. Okay, we read that there's an offering that you would have to make. Well, you can't do that part. And so that applies to you, but it doesn't apply now because you can't do it. You see? And so that's one of the things that I want to make sure that we're getting out of this. That's why we're going through it, to see the limitations to these things, but also to understand that details do matter. That was a real important instruction, is that the priest had a job with those ashes. Somebody had to do it. They knew who it was. It was supposed to be done at proper times in a certain way, wearing certain garments. I mean, it didn't just say, hey, by the way, remember to take the ashes out of the altar. Go and make sure you put on your linen outfit when you do it. And so this is also to help you understand that Yahweh is serious about details mattering. Because he didn't just say, look, make sure to clean out the ashes. And it didn't matter who. It matters who, and it matters how. It matters what you're wearing. Wow, look at all the detail there. Let's continue in number 132. Number 132 is, priests shall keep the fire burning on the altar continually. This is chapter 6 and verse 12a. In your list, if you have the list that was on the website there, it may say chapter 6 and verse 5, part A, but this is in 12a. And the fire on the altar is kept burning on it and is not put out. This is chapter 6 in the beginning of the verse. So the altar is kept burning and is not put out. And so that's the first part of this. The priest shall keep the fire burning on the altar continually. So we can see that that's a legitimate instruction. It matches up with the verse. It just doesn't apply to anybody today. There are no priests, there are no fires, there's no temple. Continuing, number 133. Priests shall not allow the fire of the altar to go out for any reason. So this is going to be part B of chapter 6 and verse 12. It says, and the priest shall burn wood on it every morning and arrange the burnt offering on it, and shall burn on it the fat of the peace offerings. Fire is continually kept burning on the altar, and it is not put out. So verse 12 and 13, again, emphasize the idea that that fire must be kept burning morning, night, it doesn't matter, for the offerings, etc., that fire is kept burning. That's a instruction that we can definitely see is in the scriptures, and again, it applies specifically to the priests in dealing with the work of the tabernacle. Number 134. Number 134. Priests shall eat of the meal offerings. This is in verses 14 through 16. We're still in chapter 6. And this is the Torah of the grain offerings. The sons of Aaron shall bring it near before Yahweh in front of the altar, and shall take from it with his hand from the fine flour of the grain offering, and from its oil and all the frankincense which is in the grain offering, and shall burn it on the altar for a sweet fragrance as its remembrance portion to Yahweh. Then Aaron and his sons eat the rest of it. It is eaten with unleavened bread in the set-apart place. They eat it in the courtyard of the tent of meeting. All right, so we now know that, again, this is an instruction that is definitely in Scripture. The priests are to eat of the meal offerings, and they are to do it in the courtyard of the tent of meeting. So are there limiters here? Absolutely. First of all, you need priests. Second of all, you need to have a courtyard of the tent of meeting. So for this to be done, even though legitimately I could say, okay, I am a Kohen, and I am, so I guess I'm a priest, so that would apply to me, but there's no courtyard and there's no tent of meeting. So I couldn't do this. Let's continue. Number 135. Priests shall not eat the meal offerings with leaven. Well, we read that in verse 17. It said verse 16, where they would eat it with unleavened bread. And verse 17 says, it is not baked with leaven. I have given it to them as their portion of my offerings made by fire. It is most set apart like the sin offering and the guilt offering. Those set apart things always needed to be unleavened, because leaven is a type and shadow of sin. It's also a type and shadow of hypocrisy. These are not things that go well with the Almighty. As a matter of fact, they don't go with Him at all. So we see that is there. That is an instruction in the Scriptures. The priest shall not eat the meal offerings with leaven. Number 136. The high priest shall offer a meal offering each day. High priest shall offer meal offerings each day. That's in verse 20. We're still in Leviticus chapter 6. Verse 20. This is the offering of Aaron and his sons, which they bring near to Yahweh, beginning on the day when he is anointed. 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour is a daily grain offering, half of it in the morning, half of it at night. So it's a daily grain offering for Aaron and his sons. They do this daily. And that's absolutely an instruction in the Scriptures, and again, it's something that cannot be done today. Number 137. Number 137. You shall not eat of the meal offerings reserved for the Kohanim. That's the high priests. The Kohanim. Those are specifically the children of Aaron, not the other Levites. Those are the Kohanim. That's in verse 22 through 23. And the anointed priest from among his sons, who is in his high place, prepares it, a law forever to Yahweh. All of it has to be burned. Every grain offering for the priest is completely burned and is not eaten. So now the verse doesn't specifically say that you're not allowed to eat of it, but it does infer it very clearly by saying the priest eats of it and whatever's left over gets burned so nobody else can eat of it. So certainly that is an instruction in the Scriptures. We can all agree that that's a legitimate interpretation, that is an instruction, but it's specifically for the Kohanim. Number 138. Number 138. You shall offer a chatat, which is a sin offering for any unintentional sin. You shall offer a chatat, sin offering, for any unintentional sin. We're at chapter 6 still, and verse 25. Speak to Aharon and to his son, saying, this is the Torah of the sin offering. In the place where the burnt offering is slaughtered, the sin offering is slaughtered before Yahweh. It is most set apart. Now here in this verse, it doesn't use the words unintentional. It doesn't use the words unintentional. But again, those who did intentional sin were not giving offerings. They were being put outside the camp. They were doing other things that they had to deal with first. The intentional sin was a much bigger problem. Matter of fact, the person doing intentional sin might likely have received capital punishment, so there was no offering to make, because they would have been stoned or put out permanently outside the camp, so there wasn't any offering to make. So the interpretation by Rambam here is that this chatat offering here was for unintentional sin. Does the verse say that? No, it doesn't. But we're inferring that here, and we'd have to do deeper research to see if we would agree with the interpretation. However, for us, it's a moot point, because we're not doing offerings, so it really is not something for us to be concerned with at this point. If at some point there's a temple, and if at some point there are offerings, I assure you that the priests will let you know what you're supposed to do. And so we'll have a way of knowing that. But for right now, we don't have to worry about these things, because they're not applying to us today. Number 139. Number 139. Priests shall not eat of a chatat or sin offering that has been brought into the holy place. So the priests are not going to eat of this. Now, there are going to be certain things that the priests do get to eat and participate in, and certain things are not. This is in verse 30. Let's look in chapter 6 and in verse 30. And no sin offering from which any of the blood is brought into the tent of meeting to make atonement in the set apart place is eaten, it is burned with fire. So certain offerings are not to be participated in. They're only for Yahweh, and everything else is burned up. They are not to be participated in. Now we're going to chapter 7, and we should all be back on the same sequencing of our numbering of our verses as we get back now into chapter 7. We're back on the same count now. Chapter 7, we're now going to look at instruction number 140. Mitzvot of the Torah 613, number 140 is, you shall offer an asham, a guilt offering, for restitution and indemnity. You shall offer an asham or guilt offering for restitution and indemnity. Now, what we're talking about here with indemnity is security against damage, loss, or injury. We're also talking about a legal exemption from liability for damages. I want you to think about that. That was part of what this whole offering was about. This was to provide, in some sense, a security against damage, loss, or injury, because you're making restitution. It's also a legal thing that you're doing. It's legally creating an exemption from liability for damages. That was what, if we can extend this to Yeshua's dying and the shed blood, that's how it covers legally liability for damages. See, because without Yeshua's blood, you are liable for the damages, which means death. You don't have any indemnity. But with his blood, you can. But you have to have his blood in making restitution. How do you make restitution? You have to make teshuvah. You have to fix your relationship with the Almighty. You have no indemnity just because he died. This is the lie of the church. The death of Messiah did not provide indemnity just because he died. There's restitution and indemnity. The indemnity to be applied to you must come with restitution. You must restore the relationship, the covenant that you broke. You didn't even know you had one, but you broke it. And so there needs to be restitution before you can have the indemnity applied to you. Does this make any sense? And so that's a very important thing. Now, he provided the possibility and the access to the indemnity once and for all. So everyone can have access, but not without restitution. So I love the way this is worded here in the number 140. Let's read the verse 1 of chapter 7. And this is the Torah of the guilt offering. It is most set apart. See? Where's the word restitution? Where's indemnity? None of it's in there. But the guilt offering was understood in much more depth by these priests and by these rabbis over the ages. And I think the Rambam hit the nail on the head here. This guilt offering has to do with your recognizing that you're wrong, that you did something that was wrong, or that you yourself were wrong, and that you're desiring to make it right. And that the offering created a situation with legal exemption for damages and for legal exemption for liability. And so Israel was being taught that that through the sacrificial system there could be an exemption from damages and liability. But yet ultimately we still needed the death of Messiah, the shed blood of Yeshua. But this was a type and shadow to teach them. And I hope we can see that in this, because I know a lot of people just They read Leviticus and all these offerings, and it gets all boring, and all of the half an ephah of this and a third of a hin of that, but it was all about learning that details matter and about how there can be indemnity if you make restitution, and that there was a cost for your actions. That there's a cost for your actions. You know what? If every time you sinned, you had to pay, think about what a lamb or a ram cost, or the turtle doves, or the whatever it was that they had to give. You would probably not make that mistake too many times, because it gets very expensive. It's kind of like, I know some of us have grown up in houses where they put a jar. Every time you say that, or every time you do this, you're going to put a quarter or a dollar, whatever, in the jar. And that'll break the habit real quick. Well, guess what? This is the original. You mess up, it's going to cost you a lamb. That's expensive. And so there was a lot that's going on here. So let's continue. Number 141. Number 141. You shall offer a shalom offering, a peace offering, for specific reasons. This is going to be in chapter 7, Leviticus chapter 7 and verse 11 through 12, and we'll continue after that. And this is the Torah of the slaughtering of the peace offerings which is brought to Yahweh. So verse 11 tells us we're talking about peace offerings. Verse 12 is going to give an example. If he brings it for thanksgiving, then he's going to do it this way. Now we can drop over to verse 16, and if the offering he brings is a vow or voluntary offering, you're going to do it this way. So there's going to be a list of some different things that you can do, or reasons to bring this offering. And so what he's saying here, he says, you shall offer shalom offerings for different reasons, for specific reasons. And depending on your specific reason, the offering is a little bit different on what you bring. And so that is a command, and that is an instruction that's here in the scriptures. Again, it just wouldn't apply to us today, because there's no way to do it. Let's continue with number 142. Priests shall not leave any thanksgiving offering until the next day. That's chapter 7 and verse 15. Chapter 7 and verse 15. As for the flesh of the slaughtering of his peace offering for thanksgiving, it is not eaten the same day it is offered. It is eaten the same day it's offered. He does not leave any until morning. So this is something that must be eaten the same day, and nothing is to be left over. That matches up with the number 142. And so we can see that's a legitimate interpretation of an instruction. Again, it wouldn't apply to us today. Leviticus chapter 7, this is number 143. Leviticus chapter 7, priests shall burn any sacrifice that has remained until the next day. So it's not only telling us in verse 15 that it's not going to remain until the next day, but if we continue, it says in verse 17, but whatever is left of the flesh of the slaughtering on the third day is burned with fire. So we're told that the priests are going to burn the sacrifice. Now it doesn't say priests there, but everything here is understood that the priests are the only ones doing all of these things. It was their job. The lay person was not doing that. They were bringing the offering, and then the priest did everything from that point forward. They handled it, they burned it, they sprinkled the blood, whatever needed to be done, they did those things. They did those things. Okay, so we can see that number 142 is 143 is right there in scriptures. Priests shall burn any sacrifice that has remained until the next day. Number 144, priests shall not eat of any sacrifice that has remained left over. In verse 18 it says, however, if any of the flesh of his peace offering is eaten at all on the third day, it is not accepted. It is not reckoned to him who brings it. It is unclean to him, and the being who eats of it bears his crookedness. That's pretty serious stuff. So we can see the inference there is that the priest shall not eat of any sacrifice that remains over, because it says, look, if anybody eats of it, it is not acceptable, and there's guilt there, there's crookedness there. We certainly do not want to be involved with that. Number 145. Number 145. Priests shall not eat of any sacrifice that has become defiled or tameh. The Hebrew would be the idea of tameh. Tameh being ritually unclean. Tahor is for clean, tameh is for unclean. Those are the two Hebrew words. We have a teaching called tameh and tahor. What state are you in? Because you're either tahor or tameh at all times. You're one or the other. Because we live in the world, because we're in the dispersion, we're tameh most of the time. because we don't generally do the rituals required to be tahor. Now you may actually feel tahor, and that's why it's so special when you come out of the water, when we mikvah. Then you feel that cleanness of being tahor. But generally, we're tameh on a very regular basis. We're unclean, and we don't do the things necessary to become clean. And so here I just want you to understand that the word defiled here is the idea of becoming unclean. We're in number 145. Priest shall not eat of any sacrifice that has become defiled. This is chapter 7 and verse 19, the beginning of the verse. And the flesh that touches that which is unclean is not eaten. Absolutely. The flesh that touches that which is unclean is not eaten. So if the animal had touched anything unclean, you can't eat it. By the way, if the animal itself is unclean, we know you can't eat it. But you're not going to bring unclean animals for an offering. But I'm just making that additional note here that not only can you not eat animals that are unclean, you can't eat animals that come into contact with that which is unclean. Oh, I'm going to mess you all up now. I'm going to just wreck all of your restaurant visits. So you go to the Chinese food and you get your vegetable egg roll that's fried in the same batter of oil that just had the pork chops in it. Do we have a problem? Or you're getting your eggs that are cooked on the same grill that just had the bacon on it. Do we have a problem? Well, it just said here, you are not to eat. Now, it's talking about offerings, but would it be a stretch to say that that applies to everything? That you're not to eat of any flesh that comes into contact with that which is unclean. How many of you have had your sandwich or your thing come and that you asked them not to put bacon on, but they put the bacon on it anyway? And so maybe you just took the bacon off and ate it anyway? It touched it. You have to send it back. You can't have it. Of course, you send it back, they're just going to take the bacon off of it and just bring it back to you. But you have to send it back. But this is why it's so challenging to eat in a restaurant. It is so challenging to eat in a restaurant because if the food is cooked on the same place the other stuff was cooked, they didn't scour it and clean it before they cooked the stuff for you, did they? No way. How many of you have had this experience, and you know you have? You're eating your eggs and you can still taste the bacon because it was cooked on the same grill where they just cooked bacon. It's happened, right? And so you know. So let's embrace that verse. I know everybody's mad at me now. I just ruined all your restaurant visits. Rabbi, do you have to mess everything up? I'm just reading it. I didn't write it. It's like the guy in Fiddler on the Roof. I didn't write it. I'm just reading it. He says, do you always have to bring bad news? He says, I didn't write it. It's not my fault. It's always bad news in the newspaper. All right, anyway. Another Fiddler on the Roof moment. Okay. This moment sponsored by Fiddler on the Roof. No, we can't have that at Shabbat. We can't have sponsors, right? Okay. So this is important. So we're looking at number 145, priest. Now it says priest, so you can say, oh, I'm not a priest. This doesn't apply to me. Now, are we minimalists or are we maximalists? Do you want to do the most or the least? On a minimalist idea, sure, you could say, well, I'm not a priest. It doesn't apply to me. Well, we're not talking about offerings either. We're now saying, can you take a lesson? Okay, we need to get into something here. I've taught this before, but I want it on this teaching as well. You know where it says, and I'm not sure where it is off the top of my head, but you know where it says that the Father wants someone who's going to worship Him in spirit and truth. He's looking for a people that will worship Him in spirit and truth. Let's define what that means. What is the truth? Well, we know the Torah is truth. Psalm 119 and verse 142 and also in verse 160. It says the word, the Torah is truth. John 14:6, Yeshua says, I am the truth. So we know Yeshua is the truth. So, okay, so we know that. So the word is truth, the Torah is truth, Yeshua is the truth. He wants someone's going to worship Him in truth. So He's looking for someone's going to be Torah observant. Okay, that's simple. We got that part. Worship Him in truth. What's the spirit part? See, Christianity would have you believe it's some sort of emotional, ooey-gooey, fuzzy sort of supernatural thing. I don't think so. It's the intent or the spirit of. See, we say the spirit of something, we mean the intent of, the way it was intended as opposed to the way others interpret it. Because we don't always interpret things the way that it was originally intended. So I want you to think of it from a school point of view. The Torah, or the law, is grade school. I say elementary school, but in some countries they call it different things. It's grade school. Everybody uses that same term. It's the basic stuff. It's where you learn ABCs and adding and dividing and multiplying, simple stuff, basic stuff, how to write, how to read. But you see, Yeshua came to teach them the spirit part. What did he say in Matthew 5? He says, Matthew 5, he said, you've heard of old, there's a Torah instruction, there's an ABC that says don't commit adultery. But I'm going to tell you the intent of that law included thinking about it, desiring to do it, even if you didn't do it. That's like the college level application, the university level application, the advanced application. So what I believe, and I want you to do this in your own thinking, is I want you to change when you see spirit and truth to advanced and basic understanding. He's looking for a people that will worship him with both the basic and the advanced understandings of his instructions. What's an advanced understanding? Loving your enemy. That's really advanced. Having joy in your trials. Not even saying racha and you fool. Oh, I didn't murder him, so what? But you killed with your tongue. There's an advanced understanding. There's a deeper understanding. Okay, so now, if he's really looking for people that are going to worship him in spirit and truth, in the basic and the advanced, then is he looking for minimalists? Is he looking for people that are going to go, well, that was for the priests. I'm not a priest. But you can apply it, can't you? There's certain things that were for the priest that you can't do. You can't do an offering if you're not a priest, and there's no altar. And all. You see, you can't do those things. But can you deal with stuff that touch something unclean? Can you worry about eating that which touched something unclean? Absolutely you can worry about that. You can be concerned with these things. Now granted, the state of Tameh was primarily a concern for you to go into the tabernacle, because if you were Tameh and went into the tabernacle, before you could enter his presence, you'd get killed. Not by the priest, but by Yahweh himself. Because he will not come into contact with sin or death. And basically, those are the things that make you unclean. That which is of sin or that which is of death. Eating something you shouldn't eat, or some unclean animal that comes in touch with some clean animal, that's sin. A dead thing that comes into contact is death. So sin and death, that's why women had to be concerned with their their monthly cycle, that during that week of the monthly cycle, that they would not touch certain things, or if men came into contact with them, because that would render them unclean, because the bleeding is that of death. Because a potential life had been lost that during that cycle. That egg that was lost was a life, potentially. And so there's a sense of death there. And so that shedding of blood is a sense of death. So that's why women with their cycles could not do certain things. And if they came into contact, there had to be certain rituals of cleaning and mikvah, which is the washings, so that you could be clean again. And that's why, to this day, Orthodox women won't shake your hand, because they're afraid they're going to make you unclean, and they don't want to have to tell you whether or not they don't want to embarrass themselves. They have to say, by the way, I'm in my cycle this week, So rather than have to worry about answering the question, or the men worried about, well, I don't know if she's in her cycle, they just don't shake hands. By the way, the men won't even try to shake the woman's hand either, knowing that, because he doesn't want to shake hands with a woman who's not even concerned about these things. By the way, that has been rendered sort of a moot point. That instruction only really affects you going into the tabernacle. But now we're talking about eating something. Now you could say the same thing, well, it only had to do with entering the tabernacle. Yes, you could say that. But again, do you want to be a maximalist or a minimalist? Do you want to be, quote unquote, rolling the dice on the fact that, hey, well, I figured it was okay. I'm not going to roll my dice and take chances. If I see something, I'm going to do whatever is possible for me to do. And that's the way I think we should be. So let's just take that, hopefully, into account. So now we're all going to become raw vegans growing our own vegetables. or raising our own cattle and sheep, and then eating our own stuff. Because that's really what he wanted us to be doing. He wanted us to be doing this as a community where we're raising our own stuff and growing our own stuff and all of that thing. And so this is important. Okay. See, I knew I had to give everybody some reason to get mad at me this week, and there it is. Okay. Number 146. Number 146. Priests shall burn any sacrifice that has become defiled. That's in the second part of verse 19. So we're still in chapter 7 and verse 19. It said, well, we read the beginning again. It says, and the flesh that touches that which is unclean is not eaten. It says, it is burned with fire. And as for the clean flesh, all who are clean will eat of it. Okay? As for clean flesh, all who are clean shall eat of it. So now it's talking about clean people. You know, there was a verse where it says like the deer and the antelope, or the deer and the gazelle, whatever it says it shall eat of it, the clean and the unclean. It's talking about the people doing the eating. Certain things we're reading here that, well, the clean can eat of this. Whatever this offering is here, the clean can eat of it. The unclean can't eat of this. Even if the flesh itself is clean, the clean can eat of this. There's something later, which now we understand why he says the clean and the unclean can eat of this one. In other words, so you may be tamei at the time, had not gone through all the rituals necessary. And even if you do the rituals, by the way, you still may have to be unclean until morning. And so it may be going on during the 24-hour period or however many hours it is between now, that time, and when you're clean. But you're allowed to eat of that one. The ones where it says both the clean and the unclean can eat of it. Here, this one says only the clean can eat of it. All who are clean can eat of it. Let's continue. Hopefully this is making clarity on some things that you always read and go, I don't get that, I'm not really sure what that's all about. Like the verse where it says about the gazelle and, the clean and the unclean can eat of it. Now you're seeing, there's stuff here where it says the clean can eat of this. So hopefully little light bulbs are going off and you're thinking there must be some deeper meaning here. There is. We don't have time to get into all that. We will at some point get into these as we get into other things, but you can go and get into it. You can dig into these things and look into them more deeply. And there's lots of teachers out there with teachings on these things that you could even glean from. Just be careful with teachers, but just like I ask you to be careful with me. Let's continue. Number 147. You shall not eat of the forbidden fat from any animal. Chapter 7, verse 23. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, do not eat any fat or of the bull or sheep or goat, and the fat of a dead body and the fat of what is torn is used for any purpose, but you do not eat it at all. Verse 25, for whoever eats the fat of the beast of which men bring as an offering made by fire to Yahweh, even the being who eats it shall be cut off from the people. Now let's look at this in context. First of all, the word fat can mean the fat. Okay, literally what we would call fat. There's the meat part, there's the fat part, there's the blood part. Okay, so this is the fat. But it also can mean in the Hebrew the choicest, richest part. So since we're talking in context here in offerings and animals, part of what he might be saying here is, look, you don't eat the choicest part, just bring me what's left over. You don't take the choicest part, you bring everything to Yahweh. And then you get whatever Yahweh didn't use for the priests. This is, again, instructions for the priests. Don't be taking out the choicest parts and then bringing me what's left. So you have a double level of meaning here. There's literally the fat, and then there's also the idea of the choicest parts. Like eating of the fat of the land, the good bounty of the land. The Hebrew word means that. It doesn't just mean literally the fat, but it means the choicest, the richness. Because you know what? Imagine the priests, they're slaughtering these animals. Certain things are supposed to be thrown into the fire and burned. Certain things are supposed to be done certain things with. And they're going, well, why waste this good part here? This is the best part. I'd like to eat this part. No, you only get to eat what Yahweh says you can eat. The rest of it gets burned in the fire. And so he's saying, do not do this. Okay? So again, we can see that that's definitely an instruction in here, that it is definitely forbidden for eating the fat. And again, it wouldn't be something we'd be doing today because we're not doing the offerings. Now, as far as eating the fat in the meat, we could probably, and when we're eating food, we could probably take that as a lesson to say, well, maybe we should avoid fat. Cut the fat off the sides of the meat and everything else the best we can. Of course, you can't get rid of all of it. It's in the meat. But You can't get rid of the fat that way. Number 148. Number 148. Leviticus chapter 7 and verse 26. This is, you shall not eat any blood of any kind. Number 148. Chapter 7 and verse 26. And do not eat any blood in any of your dwellings of bird or of beast. That's pretty straightforward. That's a pashat. In other words, a straight and simple understanding. Don't eat the blood. And I know that seems a little weird to us to just have that instruction like that, because they did have these things, these rituals where they ate blood. As a matter of fact, there's still in certain third world nations where they will puncture a hole in a living animal and put a cup up and drink its blood. I know we're getting all kinds of strange faces from people, but they do this. They do this. Once upon a time, I was watching, years and years ago, when they first were starting the show, I was watching, I think, Survivor. Okay, that reality show Survivor. And one of the things they had to do was actually, they punched a hole in the side of this big giant beast and they drank the blood. So I saw it done. So I know these are things that the people can do. And he's saying, because this was happening a lot when Israel was receiving these instructions. The nations around them did these things. Drinking blood, the vampirism, this whole idea of getting life force and strength out of blood was very common back then. It wasn't something that just popped up in recent years. I mean, this is something that goes way, way back, which is part of why we have this obsession with vampires that you see in all the TV shows and the movies. It's insane, all the vampirism. I mean, I bet you if I went on TV and counted, it'd be at least, I don't know, a half a dozen shows about vampires. The name vampire is actually in the name of the show. At least 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 shows with vampire in it. But it's the idea of getting strength out of blood is kind of what the whole vampire idea comes from. Getting life force out of blood. And Yahweh says, the life is in the blood. And he says, you are not supposed to do that. That's sick, that's twisted, it's perverted, it's twisting what Yahweh intended, because you're supposed to have your life force for you in your blood. Okay, so we have, do not eat any blood of any kind. Number 149. Priests shall not wear long hair. Priests shall not wear long hair. Now let's read the verse they give us, because I don't think it has anything to do with hair, but hey. Chapter 10 and verse 6. And Moshe said to Aaron and to Eleazar and Ithamar his sons, do not unbind your heads nor tear your garments, lest you die and wrath come upon all the people. But let your brothers, all the house of Israel, bewail the burning which Yahweh has kindled. Now, this is right after the Nadab and Abihu incident with the strange fire. And Yahweh burned them and struck them down. And this idea of unbinding your heads, that may be where Rambam is believing it has to do with long hair, but it has nothing to do with hair. It has to do with, they were to wear a very specific turban-like wrapped headgear as priests. And in other words, they had their head bound in this spiral sort of, if you've seen the Arabs do this, a lot of the Arabs do this, a lot of the Muslims do this, and so they've adopted and adapted this thing that actually was for the priest, this binding of a wrap around the head. And he's saying, look, don't mourn after those two that I just killed who were doing something sinful by unwrapping your head and by tearing your garments. It has nothing to do with the length of hair. Hair is not in this equation. By the way, it says priests shall not wear their hair long. I don't see how that plays in here. Having it long, having it not wearing long, it doesn't say that here. We know that when you did a Nazirite vow, afterwards you were to shave your head. By the way, this is also your whole body was shaved. So even the idea of having beards, well, if you couldn't have a beard and do the Nazirite vow, because at the end of it you shave it off the beard. So how the instruction for the beard? But we're going to get there at some point. But now, this one, I'm going to say, I don't get it. I don't know why he says this. And so there is no instruction not to wear your hair long. In this verse, it's not there. Priests shall not wear their hair long. Leviticus 10:6 has nothing to do with that. Let's continue. I want to get a couple of more done before we get to chapter 11, and we'll pick up with that next time. Number 150. Number 150. Priests shall not enter the temple with torn garments. Again, he's pointing to verse 6 here we just read, which says not to tear your garments. Now, they were told not to tear them. It had nothing to do with not tearing them and entering into the temple, but it's a reasonable thing to assume or to conclude that if you had to wear special things to walk into the temple, walking in with torn garments wasn't going to work. So even though that verse doesn't actually say that, and we have instructions where they're not to tear their garments, a priest is told not to tear them. We talked about that in other verses when we were in Exodus. So I can be okay with that, the idea of not entering the temple with torn garments. I don't see the verse saying that specifically, but I can certainly agree with that. Would it apply to you today? Well, if you were a priest and there was a temple, it would. But you're not, most of you are not priests, and there is no temple. Continuing. Number 151. Priests shall not leave the temple during a service. Priests shall not leave the temple during a service. This is now verse 7 of chapter 10. It says, and do not go out from the door of the tent of meeting lest you die, for the anointing oil of Yahweh is upon you. And they did according to the word of Moshe. Again, this has nothing to do with the number 151. They were told not to leave the tent of meeting until what was finished going on there, because again, they were not to run away from what they just saw. They were not to mourn about what they just saw. They were to deal with and accept and learn the lesson from what they just saw, and they weren't to leave until Yahweh was done. So the idea of priests not leaving the temple during a service, I can see that that would be true, but I don't see it here in this verse. They were told in this verse about this situation not to leave. Don't run away from this. Don't mourn about this. Learn from this. That's, I think, what Yahweh was trying to talk about here. And last, we're going to go into number 152. Priest shall not enter the temple if he's drunk. This is verse 9 of chapter 10. Chapter 10 and verse 9. Do not drink wine or strong drink, you nor your sons with you, when you go into the tent of meeting, lest you die, a law forever throughout your generations. So priests are not to drink when they're working, when they're going into the tent of meeting. They're not to drink wine or strong drink or be drunk when they enter the tent of meeting. Now, it doesn't say that they can't drink or even have strong drink at other times. What it does say is they can't do it when they're entering the tent of meeting, when they're doing their rounds. Because remember, there were rotations. And not everybody was working in the tent of meeting at the same time. There were rotations. We learn about the rotations when we learn about, Yeshua's father, and he was doing a rotation. With John's father. John's father was doing a rotation. And so we kind of can figure out when John was born so that we can figure out when Yeshua was born, because we know how the distance between when they were born, how many months difference that was, by trying to figure out what rotation John's father was in and when that rotation did its rounds. Because if you were a high priest, you weren't working all the time. They took turns, because it was a very hard and exhaustive job. You couldn't do it 365 days a year. You had to rotate. And so there was a rotation. And so when you were in your rotation, you were not to drink wine or strong drink. So I could agree with that, absolutely. And that would be Leviticus chapter 10 and verse 9. Now look, as a Kohen, I'm still trying to work out my Maximus sort of approach to that verse. Okay, so I don't go into the tent of meeting, but I'm here with you guys at services. We do a Kiddush and m.t.o.i before our meal, which is after the service is over. So is it okay for me to drink that tiny little bit of wine or not? And so I'm in prayer about that, because I don't want to look at it from a minimalist point of view. So my leaning would be just to avoid it, but I'm not, you know what I'm saying? See, I'm just giving you my personal testimony, an example of how I'm trying to approach any of these instructions that may apply to me, because I want to err on the side of conservatism. I'd rather do something that I may not be sure I need to do, but just in case I'll do it anyway. I'd rather not do something I'm not sure I don't need to do, just to be safe. Better to be safe than to be sorry. You can't ever be in trouble doing more. What did Yeshua say about the servant who did everything that was asked of him? He said, you useless and lazy servant. If all you did is what was asked of you, of what use is that? But those that he expects you to go above and beyond. He's not looking for just a legalist letter of the law. He wants you to be more than legalist. He wants you to do the spirit. He wants you to apply the intent. He wants you to apply what was originally given, how it was intended to be applied in its fullness, the advanced understanding. And so I want us to embrace that. Okay, so that's going to conclude us for today, a short day. My wife's going to be thinking, sure, you're short the one day I'm in the room and I'm not doing the kids' class. But I want to stop here because next we're going to get into Leviticus 11 with all of the food laws. And so rather than just get some of them done, I'm going to start with the next part with Leviticus chapter 11 with instruction number 153. So we finished here, finishing 152. We got a lot done today. I think it was good. Let's go before the Father. Avinu Malkeinu, Father, we want to come before you and we want to thank you so much for all of your instruction, for the wisdom, for even the things that we can learn out of these details of things that we may otherwise have overlooked. Father, we want to thank you for giving us an opportunity to come once a week and have you fill us with your Spirit, give us wisdom and understanding and discernment to teach us more about who you are and what you're all about and what you desire for us so that we can be pleasing in your sight. Father, help us to have a maximus as opposed to a minimus. I almost sound like a Greek there, maximus. But to look to do the most we can, not the least we can. Father, help us to truly desire to do the most we can and not the least we can, so that we can be found to be worthy of the words, well done, you good and faithful servant, because we were faithful in what we were given. Father, help us to be faithful so you'll want to give us more. Help us to be faithful in the little you give us so we'll be worthy of more. Father, overflow us and fill us. We just want so badly to be like you and pleasing in your sight. Father, we want to thank you now for the words of wisdom, the discernment you've given us, and for the understanding. And we want to thank you for our high priest, as we're learning now all about a lot of things to deal with the priests. We know we don't have the priests actively working on this earth right now, the Levitical priesthood. We know there's no temple here on this planet, but we know that there is a temple in heaven, and there is a high priest, a Melchizedekian high priest, the one true high priest, Yeshua there presiding as high priest in that temple. And Father, we are just so thankful that he is advocating on our behalf and presiding over all things as high priest and coming king. Father, we want to just thank you again and praise your name, in his name, in Yeshua's name. Amen. Amen.